2 Sundays ago, it was time for the NFL's NFC and AFC championship games for the 2023-2024 season, with the Kansas City Chiefs taking down the favored Baltimore Ravens and the Detroit Lions blowing a game that seemed to be over at halftime against the San Francisco 49ers, setting up a Super Bowl 58 between a team that some thought the championship window had closed on just 2 months ago when the Chiefs were in freefall, and a team in the 49ers that seemingly could only be beat by their own injuries. While none of those 4 teams are amongst my favorites, they were both very entertaining games, if you happen to be an outsider and were just watching for fun rather than fandom. Although, I've got to say, it's a little bit hard to not feel some sympathy pains for those long-suffering Detroit fans, especially with just how they lost that game. I mention all this not just because it's topical and because I'm reviewing a game this week based on and licensed by the NFL, but because with the San Francisco 49ers being involved, as the cameras pan to the sidelines, who just happened to be there but Joe Montana himself, the cover and title athlete of not just this week's game, NFL Sports Talk Football 93, starring Joe Montana, but also several other Sega football games, not just on the Genesis, but also the Sega CD and the Master System. And I've got to say, Joe still looks pretty good. He's clearly taking care of himself for someone that took a ton of hard hits back in the day and is almost as old as my mom. It's almost like you can see why Sega signed him up to try to compete against the John Madden Football juggernaut at Electronic Arts, even 30 years later. But I should probably back up for a second, because I'm sure there's some of you out there that don't know me and just randomly got dropped here by the algorithm due to searching for probably the best quarterback to ever play the game besides a certain Tom Brady. My name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'm out to collect and review not just video games that have an announcer that's less annoying than Joe Buck, but also the nearly 1,280 other titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. In 2024, with there really only being one football franchise of note these days, it's a little bit weird to think back to the early 90s when there was actually different game series that were competing for console pro football dominance. In the Christmas season of 1992, Sega was having to contend with not just one John Madden Football title in John Madden Football 93, but also Electronic Arts double-dipped that year and released John Madden Football 93 Champion Edition as well. And while it wasn't sold in stores, it did hold valuable shelf space in Blockbuster Video. And perhaps now that might not seem like a big deal, but back then, if you did well in the rental stores, it was going to translate into name recognition and more sales. Ultimately, 1992 was the last year that a non-Electronic Arts football game would be truly competitive for the NFL crown until the NFL 2K series launched on the Dreamcast 7 years later. But why was that? Did Sega not do enough to upgrade Sports Talk Football 93 to keep up? Or was it still a solid title, but ultimately a futile effort due to Electronic Arts expanding the John Madden Football brand to other consoles, amongst other reasons? Well, we shall see, but first a look at the package. And this is my copy of NFL Sports Talk Football 93 starring Joe Montana. And all 28 NFL teams, apparently. I think most people usually just cut it off at the starring Joe Montana part, if they even get that far. This particular copy is in really nice shape. Not perfect, mind you, but there's definitely very minimal wear to the outside of the case, and the hang tab is intact at the top. Something nice to see after the last few weeks where they had all been removed. The inner cover is pristine and looks exactly how it looked when it was originally on sale over 30 years ago, with the vibrant colors of the photo cover art showing through, and no sun bleaching or water damage. This particular copy only cost me $5 when I originally picked it up, and I know that because it still had the price tag on the cover until right before I reviewed it, and even today you can routinely pick it up for between $8 and $10. As far as that cover art goes, with this being a late 1992 release, this was one of the later first-party titles that still had the black cross-hatching border format that would get used until mid-1993. And I like it. It really makes the photo cover stand out, with a nice shot of Joe rolling out to try to complete a pass, while thankfully not wearing a generic uniform or having any logos airbrushed out, since Sega did obtain the NFL license for this year for the first time, hence why it says that it includes Joe Montana in all 28 NFL teams. Maybe that's a bit redundant with the game literally having NFL at the beginning of its title, but I definitely understand why they wanted to make that selling point as clear as possible. While Sports Talk Football 93 didn't get a release in Japan, it did get a release in Europe, and as such, the European version did get a slightly different front cover, with almost all the same information, minus that fairly ugly 12 meg star at the bottom. Between having that removed and the picture of Joe enlarged to make up more of the front of the cover, I think I do prefer that European cover, but they're both fine. And don't get me wrong, I get Sega wanting to advertise that it was a 12 meg game, as that was a pretty large cartridge at the time, but why does the graphic that appears have to look like a bullet hole instead of a more traditional star? I mean, if this was an action game like Lethal Enforcers or something, then sure, it makes sense, but it's just pretty out of place here. Flipping over the back, and now we can definitely see the NFL part of the game with the graphics of helmets of 10 of the 28 teams adorning the rear of the cover, and then some flavor text, bullet points, and screenshots over what appears to be a blown up grass field texture that I'm guessing comes from the game. Regardless of where it does come from, it's a bit dark to have black text on top of it, and to compound things, most of the text is incredibly small, making the whole thing a chore to read. But at least the screenshots are of decent quality, although they, like the text, are a bit on the small side. Just as an aside, I do find this line an eerie premonition of things to come. Or run and shoot the Oilers past the Bills in an AFC showdown. Now, keep in mind that Sports Talk 93 was released in November of 1992. Now, why is that important? Well, just a month later, on January 3rd, 1993, in the wildcard round of the playoffs, the Bills would beat the Oilers in what is known as the comeback, a game which still holds the record for largest comeback in the playoffs, with the Bills coming back from being down 32-3 to come back and win the game. Now, of course, the line suggesting using the Oilers to beat the Bills is just a coincidence, but I do find it a little bit spooky that Oilers fans would want to have a reason to rectify that loss. Opening up the box, and the manual and cartridge are in good shape. The manual does a thorough job of explaining all the options in the game, complete with screenshots, and even provides a short walkthrough to get players started with how to play the game, which is nice. The manual is also a bit thicker than normal, as the end is dedicated to detailing the star players on each team and 2 recommended plays to use, which, while it's nice, has questionable value for reasons that I'll get to later on in the review. Okay, that's the package. Let's get to the game and see if the power of NFL licensing has what it takes to get the Joe Montana series to the next level. Before we get into the game itself, let's talk about the most important thing about sports game sequels, and that is what has changed from the previous edition of the game. And in this case, that's referring to Joe Montana 2 Sports Talk Football, a game that I thought was fantastic and far beyond where John Madden Football was at the time, with the competing John Madden Football 92. To say that Sports Talk 93 had a high bar to clear to improve from the previous title is an understatement, just due to all of the things that they had gotten right already. Probably the most visible change to the game is the aforementioned addition of NFL license, so that now teams can be referred to with their proper names and logos. From an actual gameplay perspective, it doesn't really affect things much, but it does help the game have a more authentic feel to now be able to be playing as the actual teams from the NFL, rather than teams that kind of, sort of look like the real thing and just happen to be located in the same cities as said teams. John Madden Football 93, the game's direct competitor, was still missing any kind of licensing from the game and wouldn't have NFL licensing until next year's edition, so in that regard, it at least served as some bragging rights that Sports Talk 93 had over its competition. Unfortunately, while the game added NFL licensing, it would still not yet have NFLPA licensing, meaning that none of your favorite players actually appeared in the game, at least not by name anyway. On the surface, that might seem disappointing, but honestly, with the way the game is presented, it doesn't really matter, which may be more of an indictment of the game itself rather than the lack of NFLPA licensing. I say this because other than the manual mentioning that each team has a few notable star players in the game, by player number, not name of course, nowhere else in the game is it indicated which player's which, regardless of the number. To be clear, what I mean is when your team takes the field, there's no indication of which player is which. You're just allotted 11 players that line up on the field, all with the exact same uniform and look, and other than a yellow ring around the player that you're controlling, there's no indication of who is who. So while it's nice that at least certain star players on each team have been granted certain stats, it's unclear if all players have individual ratings or if it's just the stars, you have no way of knowing if you're controlling one of them, unless it's the quarterback since there's only one. This doesn't break the game, mind you, but it does make things less strategic. A good example of this is, say you're playing as the Giants, and you want to choose number 56 Lawrence Taylor. Well, how would you know which linebacker to choose? Or let's say you want to go with the cover namesakes team with Joe Montana and the 49ers, and you want to throw to number 80 Jerry Rice. Well, how do you know which receiver is Jerry? To add insult to injury, when it comes to the subject of star players, Sports Talk 93 is actually missing a feature that Joe Montana 2 had, and that's the custom team feature. In Joe Montana 2, you could actually make up your own all-star team amongst the various star players and select up to 6 players from around the league to be on your team, and then save that team via password. I'm not sure how often this feature was actually used, but it was cool and part of how advanced Joe Montana 2 seemed at the time, as having customized rosters wasn't something that other football games would have for a few years, and removing the option, even if possibly being underutilized, seems like a step backwards. Going back to the new additions to the game from the previous installment, Sega's added some features to the camera angle aspect. Joe Montana 2 was notable for switching to a horizontal field display from the vertical display that the original game used. I'm sure there's people that will argue for one or the other, but at the end of the day, the horizontal display worked for Joe Montana 2. Now in Sports Talk 93, Sega have addressed that people prefer the vertical display of its direct competitor John Madden Football 93, and added the option to either play in the traditional horizontal view or switch to a vertically focused view on the offense or defense, and allowing players to switch the display at will during games, very similar to the just-reviewed ESPN National Hockey Night a few episodes ago. The game also features a blimp camera angle, which I have to assume was just included as a joke, with gameplay from far overhead the stadium showing the entire field with each of the players just represented as small dots. The game can actually be played like this, but for the life of me, I don't know why anyone would want to for more than just a play or two to see how it looks. The last major change to gameplay that has to be discussed is play calling. On defense, you're not going to notice much of a difference, as it's still the same traditional choose a formation and then choose a play from that formation setup that was fairly standard at that point. However, on offense, things get a bit more complicated. Now, before you can choose a play, you have to choose 3 configurations, which are done by switching between 3 different sets of options via the A, B, and C buttons. The A button is used to pick between which personnel grouping you're going with, meaning how many running backs, receivers, and tight ends are on the field. The B button is then used to choose which formation you want to call a play using, and keep in mind that depending on the personnel group that you chose, only certain matching formations will be available. And then the C button is labeled options, but really it's just to pick whether your quarterback is lined up directly under center or in shotgun formation. And again, depending on the personnel group and formation, you may not actually have a choice here. On the one hand, I really like how modular the play calling system is. It's certainly more advanced than I think I've ever dealt with in any other football game. But unfortunately, that's also a double-edged sword, as the added complexity can make it difficult to find specific plays that you want to run, and due to how things are organized. And adding to the problem is how the formations in the game are labeled. They're not exactly what you would call descriptive. Each formation is named for a different color, so you frequently run into the problem of trying to remember if a certain play is under gold, purple, black, etc., instead of what you might see in Madden with categories like I formation, wishbone, run and shoot, etc. Once you get used to things, it's not terrible, but it still just seems needlessly complex, and it definitely could use some refinement for ease of use. The one thing I do like, however, is that each team has a different playbook, and while I could see the argument that that's technically limiting your choices as a player, it's also very realistic, as each NFL team does run different plays, and you wouldn't expect a pass-happy team to utilize the same plays as one that focuses on the run game. And this also adds some more strategy into which team you choose to play, as beyond just how good of a team's players are. Once you get past those things, there really isn't that much difference between Sports Talk 93 and Joe Montana 2, and I can't help but feel slightly disappointed in that. Now, granted, Joe Montana 2 was a revolutionary game, so it makes sense that Sega would rest on their laurels a little bit in certain areas. But I am a bit disappointed in two specific things that didn't see an improvement. The first of those things is a simple thing, but unfortunately, Sports Talk 93 still relies on a password system to save your progress when playing in full season mode. Granted, I should probably just be happy that the game has a full season mode at all, seeing as how John Madden Football wouldn't add that feature until next year. But this is the same setup that Joe Montana 2 had, so would it really have been that difficult to add battery backup instead? Thankfully, the passwords aren't very long, only consisting of 10 characters, but still, if they were going to spend the money on making that big 12 megabit cartridge, couldn't they have thrown in a battery as well? The other thing that I'm a bit disappointed isn't better in this game is actually probably related to still relying on that password system somewhat, but that's the lack of any kind of personal stats, or stats from game to game. Sports Talk 93 does feature some fairly robust team stats that are collected for each quarter and at the end of the game, and those are kind of nice to browse through, but the stats are specifically just kept on a per-game basis and then forgotten about, leaving the season play to become solely about just wins and losses. I'm sure with having a password system, there was no way to keep up with stats throughout the season, but it's still unfortunate. Also, note that I only said the game keeps up with team stats and not individual player stats. This kind of goes back to the earlier problem I mentioned where the game keeps players somewhat anonymous, and you don't really know who is doing what. It's not the end of the world, but when you review a game like NHL 94, which at least has some nice basic stat tracking, and then play something like this, it illustrates just how far football games still had to come. Getting beyond just the various game features and what the game can and cannot do, what is left? Well, if you play Joe Montana 2, you'll be picking up and playing Sports Talk 93 in no time, but it's not without issue. As mentioned, now with an actual NFL license, you can pick from each of the 28 NFL teams that existed at the time, and either play a one-off exhibition or take on season mode, with the option of either executing the plays yourself or choosing coach mode, where you just call the plays and let the computer battle it out on the field. The game still has the same relatively simple control scheme of the previous game, and for the most part, I think it plays pretty well with a few notable exceptions. The first issue I ran into was with the game's new vertical display mode. Unfortunately, with the angle that's used to display the field and no passing windows, your receivers can go off screen relatively quickly, and as a result, you have no idea what situation they're in when you pass to them, which is why I tended to stick to the tried and true horizontal mode from the previous game. However, even when you can see what's going on, interceptions seem to occur at a much higher rate than I would expect, and players will struggle to complete even 50% of their passes, and that's in the what's otherwise far too easy beginner difficulty mode, much less either of the other more difficult modes. Specifically, I had a game where I accidentally chose the Patriots in normal mode, but I decided to just roll with it and see how things would play out with a team that I wouldn't normally choose. Now, granted, the 1992 Patriots were terrible, going 2-14 and starting 4 different quarterbacks throughout the year, with none of them being named Brady or Bledsoe. And when you check their star players in the manual, none of them are listed at the quarterback option. But even with that being the case, I still wouldn't expect to throw 7 interceptions in a game played with 5-minute quarters. Frequently in that game and in others, I would see players just either run incorrect routes or simply give up on plays and just let the interception happen.
I don't recall Joe Montana 2 being that bad in the passing game, so I'm not exactly sure what happened here, but this clearly needed some more work. Perhaps if you used the game's manual passing mode, things might be a bit better, but I don't feel like I should have to engage that just to complete a pass. And it's the same way for the computer as well, so clearly the passing engine just needs work all the way around. From a graphics perspective, the game looks pretty similar to Joe Montana 2 as you would expect. The teams are all colored correctly now, and the players are redrawn slightly with more detail that clearly shows in these zoomed in segments. Other than the previous mentioned issue with the vertical displays and the passing, both the vertical and horizontal displays look good, and I really enjoy when the game zooms in to focus on the action. It makes the game feel more like an actual TV broadcast, as opposed to the game just relying on the same end zone or press box camera the entire time. I can't really fault what Sega did here. The game looks like an improved Joe Montana 2, and for late 1992, I'm not really sure what else you could ask for. On the sound front, well, this is NFL Sports Talk Football 93 after all, so that means we're getting round 2 of the automated play-by-play announcer, labeled on the back of the box as Sports Talk 2.0, and supposedly having 2 times as many lines. And while I can't really point to any specific words or phrases that sounded like they were added, the announcing did seem smoother and more lifelike. Of course, it's still plenty robotic, but considering the era that the game was released in, and the fact that this is all being compressed and kept in a 12 megabit cartridge, I'll never cease to be impressed by it. It follows all the action in the game well, and in all of the games that I played, I can't think of a time when it made an error in calling the plays or glitching out. And it just, on the whole, adds to the broadcast feeling of the game. Aside from the Sports Talk announcer, the music used in the various menus is fine. I wouldn't specifically call it bad, but it does make some interesting choices with the samples that they used. Thankfully though, the sound effects are solid, and the crowd noise now actually sounds like crowd noise rather than aimless static, like we've seen in other titles recently. NFL Sports Talk Football 93 starring Joe Montana was honestly a game that was put in a tough position before it was even released. With as revolutionary as a title as its predecessor was, releasing a game that didn't make a similar leap forward was going to seem like a bit of a disappointment, and we're talking about a pretty big leap. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened, and while Sports Talk 93 is a solid pro football title, to get awarded 4 stars again, it really would have had to have done everything right, and that's just not the case. As a result, I'm giving NFL Sports Talk Football 93 starring Joe Montana 3 stars, because the things that the game does well are still noteworthy, especially in comparison to its direct competition at the time. But there's certainly work to be done here if the sequel is going to survive what's coming on the horizon from Electronic Arts.
Okay, and that's it for NFL Sports Talk Football 93 starring Joe Montana on the Genesis. And honestly, after 20 minutes or so of runtime, I'm just glad that I don't ever have to say that full title ever again. That is a mouthful. Now, I want to be clear, this is a good game, and if you got it for Christmas in 1992, you were probably a happy kid. It's just that I was really looking for more, and the problems with the passing game are confounding at best. If I had to guess, I think Sega tried to possibly make the passing game a little bit more complex in this title, and they just ended up overcorrecting and going too far with things. Hopefully that, and then other things that I was looking for, will be fixed next time around. Now, next time on Zilog and Moto, it is your favorite. It is another sports game. Now, wait. Before you throw heavy things at myself and the possibly expensive screen that you're looking at, in my defense, it is not your average sports title, and it's for that exotic, overlooked, and unappreciated console, the 32X. Yeah, we're going ahead and getting this season's 32X review out of the way early on. Now this is a game where technically I've already reviewed the Genesis version, so I'm not sure how different this experience is going to be, but it is 2 years later, and maybe that prior experience will allow me to have a deeper insight this time around. It's tough to say. You'll just have to tune in next week to see. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 227. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.